Distinguished viewers, what happened on television this week exposes the desperation at the heart of the Trump administration's strategy against Canada. On Monday evening, January 27th, United States Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent appeared on Fox News claiming that Prime Minister Mark Carney had aggressively walked back his Davos speech during a private phone call with President Trump. Bessent stated this as fact, describing Carney as retreating from his bold declaration that the rules-based global order has ruptured. But less than 12 hours later on Tuesday morning, January 28th, standing before reporters on Parliament Hill in Ottawa, Mark Carney directly contradicted Bessent's account. To be absolutely clear, and I said this to the president, I meant what I said in Davos, Carney declared, his tone leaving no ambiguity. This was not diplomatic softening or careful word choice. This was the Prime Minister of Canada calling the United States Treasury Secretary a liar on the public record. What unfolded over the next 48 hours reveals something profound about the shifting power dynamics between Washington and Ottawa, and why American officials are now resorting to fabricated narratives to save face. To understand why Scott Bessent felt compelled to lie about that phone call, we must examine what Mark Carney actually said in Davos, and why it struck such a nerve in Washington. On January 20th at the World Economic Forum, Carney delivered a speech that has now been viewed by millions and analyzed by foreign policy experts across the globe. He spoke for 20 minutes about the collapse of American hegemony as a stabilizing force in the global order, the weaponization of economic tools like tariffs by great powers, and the urgent need for middle powers like Canada to unite and build alternative frameworks for cooperation. Carney used language that was precise and uncompromising. "We are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition," he stated. "When middle powers only negotiate bilaterally with a hegemon, we negotiate from weakness. We accept what is offered. This is not sovereignty. It is the performance of sovereignty while accepting subordination." These were not off-the-cuff remarks. This was a carefully constructed argument that Canada will no longer subordinate its national interests to American pressure. The reaction in Washington was immediate and visceral. Trump responded the next day in Davos, claiming Canada lives because of the United States, and demanding Carney remember that fact. Trump then revoked Carney's invitation to his Board of Peace, a symbolic expulsion designed to humiliate the Canadian leader. But Carney did not back down. On January 22nd in Quebec City, he reinforced his message in a national address. "Canada and the United States have built a remarkable partnership," he said, "but Canada does not live because of the United States. Canada thrives because we are Canadian." Behind closed doors, American officials were reportedly furious. Carney's Davos speech had received a standing ovation, praise from leaders across Europe, Australia, and Latin America. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte called it evidence that Canada is back as a pivotal global leader. Even California Governor Gavin Newsom reportedly shared the transcript with other American officials, saying, "Wow." The speech was effective because it articulated what many allied nations were thinking, but lacked the courage to say publicly. Trump's economic coercion and erratic trade policy had alienated traditional partners, and Carney had given voice to that alienation in the most high-profile setting imaginable. American officials needed to regain control of the narrative, and that is where Scott Bessent's lie comes into the story. On Monday, January 27th, President Trump called Prime Minister Carney for what both sides acknowledged was a tense conversation. The call lasted approximately 30 minutes and covered multiple topics, including Ukraine, Arctic security, in the context of Greenland tensions, and Canada's recent trade agreement with China. According to Carney's account delivered the following day, he used the call to explain Canada's strategic diversification, emphasizing that Canada was the first country to understand Trump's change in trade policy and is responding accordingly. Carney told Trump that Canada has secured 12 new trade deals across 4 continents in 6 months, partnerships that reduce Canadian dependence on the American market from 75% to a projected 60% within 3 years. Carney says Trump was impressed by this accomplishment, a detail that, if true, reveals much about Trump's actual understanding of the strategic implications. But that same evening, Scott Bessent appeared on Fox News and provided a completely different characterization of the call. Carney was very aggressively walking back some of the unfortunate remarks he made at Davos, Bessent claimed, his tone suggesting victory for the Trump administration. The implication was clear. The Canadian Prime Minister had been intimidated into retreat, the American pressure campaign was working, and the Davos speech was merely posturing that crumbled under direct presidential confrontation. This narrative would have served multiple purposes for the White House. It would demonstrate Trump's dominance over a defiant ally. It would discourage other middle powers from following Carney's example. And it would allow American officials to dismiss the Davos speech as empty rhetoric rather than a genuine statement of Canadian policy. There was only one problem with Bessent's account. It was not true. The next morning on Parliament Hill, reporters asked Carney directly about Bessent's characterization. The Prime Minister's response was unequivocal and devastating. To be absolutely clear, and I said this to the President, I meant what I said in Davos. Carney then explained that he had told Trump exactly what Canada's strategic pivot entails, that he described the 12 trade agreements and Canada's arrangement with China, and that the conversation confirmed rather than contradicted his Davos message. This was a Prime Minister calling out a lie in real time, refusing to allow American officials to rewrite the narrative of a private conversation for public consumption. The implications of this moment cannot be overstated. In traditional diplomacy, when officials from allied nations provide conflicting accounts of private conversations, there's usually careful ambiguity that allows both sides to claim their version is accurate. Carney abandoned that diplomatic courtesy. He stated plainly that Bessent's account was false, forcing American officials into a position where they either had to escalate by calling Carney a liar in return, or tacitly admit their Treasury Secretary had misrepresented the conversation. Scott Bessent chose escalation. The very next day, January 28th, Bessent appeared at a White House event launching Trump accounts and gave an interview to CNBC where he doubled down on his attack against Carney. I would just encourage Prime Minister Carney to do what he thinks is best for the Canadian people, not his own virtue signaling, Bessent stated, his condescension unmistakable. He accused Carney of rising to power on an anti-American, anti-Trump message, suggesting this was merely political theater rather than substantive policy. Bessent added a personal insult, stating that in his investment career, he has seen what happens when a technocrat tries to pivot and become a politician. It never really works out well. This was no longer about the phone call. This was a Treasury Secretary attempting to undermine the legitimacy of a democratically elected allied leader by suggesting he is unqualified for political office. The arrogance is breathtaking, but the strategy is transparent. Unable to refute Carney's policy arguments or reverse Canada's strategic diversification, Bessent resorted to ad hominem attacks, questioning Carney's motives and competence. But here's what Bessent's escalation actually reveals. The Trump administration has no effective leverage against a Canada that has chosen economic independence, and American officials know it. Defenders of the Trump administration argue that Bessent is simply being realistic about power dynamics, that Canada's economy is multiple times smaller than America's, and therefore Canada must ultimately accommodate American demands. This argument ignores the fundamental shift in global economics that Carney identified in Davos. Size matters less when alternatives exist, and Canada has spent 6 months building those alternatives at unprecedented speed. The China trade agreement lowers Canadian tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles to 6.1% in exchange for Beijing reducing tariffs on Canadian canola and other agricultural exports. The Qatar partnership, signed January 18th, opens Middle Eastern investment in Canadian infrastructure and energy. The UAE deal, announced in November, brings $70 billion in long-term capital. Indonesia's free trade agreement provides access to Southeast Asian markets. Each of these partnerships reduces the percentage of Canadian exports dependent on American market access. The cruel irony is that Trump's aggressive tariff threats have accelerated this diversification rather than preventing it. Before Trump began threatening Canada with annexation and punitive tariffs, Canadian political consensus favored maintaining deep integration with the American economy, despite occasional tensions. Trump's behavior has fundamentally altered that consensus. Even conservative premiers in provinces like Ontario and Alberta, traditionally the most pro-American voices in Canadian politics, now support Carney's diversification strategy because they recognize American partnership has become unreliable. Bessent can insult Carney's qualifications and question his motives, but he cannot reverse the structural transformation of Canada's trade architecture that makes American economic threats increasingly irrelevant. What we witnessed this week was not simply a diplomatic spat or conflicting accounts of a phone call, We witnessed the public exposure of American dishonesty in service of a failing strategy. Scott Bessent lied about Mark Carney's position because the truth that Canada is calmly and systematically building economic independence from the United States is too threatening to acknowledge. The Treasury Secretary's subsequent attacks on Carney's character and qualifications reveal desperation rather than strength. When you cannot defeat the policy, you attack the person. When you cannot refute the argument, you question the motive. But none of it changes the underlying reality. Canada has secured 12 trade agreements in 6 months. Canada has diversified its export markets and attracted massive foreign investment. Canada has built international coalitions of middle powers that share concerns about American economic coercion. This is not theater. This is not virtue signaling. This is permanent transformation of Canada's economic foundations. And no amount of lying by American officials will reverse it. Canada no longer needs to ask for permission.